All right, let's dive in. Today, we're looking at the two truths.
Two truths.
Yeah, in Indian philosophy, this idea of two truths, it's like a really big deal in Buddhism especially. It's this whole way of understanding reality.
I see, like appearance versus reality, that sort of thing.
Yeah, kind of, but it's more nuanced. You've got the conventional truth, the way things seem to us every day, and then the ultimate truth, how things actually are.
Right, like a deeper level of reality. So, where does this idea come from? I mean, is it explicitly in the early Buddhist texts?
That's where it gets interesting. The Pitapatra Samagama Sutra, this ancient text, it suggests that it was the Buddha's grasp of this distinction between the two truths that led to his enlightenment.
Oh, wow. So, like, understanding these two levels of reality is the key to awakening.
Yeah, that's what they claim. Pretty profound, right?
Absolutely. And how early are we talking here? Is this a later development in Buddhist thought or something more foundational?
The Samadhiraja Sutra, another early text, it makes a really bold claim. It says that the theory of two truths was the Buddha's own unique contribution, like he came up with it himself.
So, not something borrowed from other Indian philosophies.
Right. It says, and I'm quoting here, the knower of the world, without hearing it from others, taught that there are two truths.
So, from the very beginning, this was seen as central. And what about later Buddhist thinkers? How did they engage with this idea?
Well, you can't talk about the two truths without talking about Nagarjuna, this giant figure in Buddhist philosophy. He built his whole system around it.
Right, Nagarjuna, 2nd century CE, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, around then.
Yeah.
And in his Mulamadhyamakakarika, he explicitly states that the Dharma taught by the Buddhas is precisely based on the two truths, a truth of mundane conventions and a truth of the ultimate.
So for him, it was the very foundation of Buddhist teachings.
Absolutely. So what we're going to do today is kind of trace this idea. We're going to see how different schools of Buddhist thought in India interpreted these two truths, how they wrestled with it over the centuries. It's a wild ride, really different perspectives on reality.
Yeah, and as a philosopher, I'm particularly interested in seeing how these different interpretations reflect deeper assumptions about, ontology and epistemology, like what exists and how do we know it.
Exactly. And I think it's important to acknowledge that while the two truths became so central, they don't just appear fully formed in the earliest Buddhist texts.
Right, so it's an evolving idea, not just a static doctrine.
Yeah, some scholars suggest that it actually grew out of earlier distinctions about how to understand the Buddha's words. There were terms like nitatha, which meant the definitive meaning, and nayata, the interpretive meaning.
Oh, interesting. So seeds of the idea were there in those early interpretive frameworks.
Right. And there's this cool connection in the commentary on the Anguttara Nikaya where they link these interpretive modes with a distinction between sammuti and paramatha.
Most terms sound familiar.
Yeah, those are kind of like early linguistic versions of conventional and ultimate truth. So this idea starts small and then, bam, it explodes into all these different interpretations as different schools of thought emerge and grapple with it.
And we're talking about some heady hitters here. Sarvastivada, Sautrantika, Yogacara, and then the branches of Madhyamaka, Savatantrika, and Prasangika. Each one, while accepting these two truths, really went in its own direction.
Totally. Okay, so why don't we start with the Sarvastivada, sometimes called the Vaifika school. Where did they land on this two truths business?
So the Sarvastivadins, they were all about ultimate reality being made up of these fundamental, irreducible bits, like building blocks of existence.
Right, kind of like atoms.
Yeah, they believed in ultimately real spatial units, sort of like atoms, and also these super fleeting moments of consciousness called point instant consciousnesses.
Okay, so these tiny bits of matter and super fast flashes of awareness, that was the ultimate for them. And what about everything else?
Everything else, like the objects we see around us, the flow of time, all that, they considered conventional reality. Basically just combinations and continuations of those ultimate bits.
Makes sense. So how did they actually define conventional truth? Like what made something conventional for them?
Vasubandhu, in his Abhidharmakosha, gives a pretty clear definition. He says that something is conventionally true if, when you destroy it or mentally break it down, you can no longer think about it in the same way.
Okay, can you give me an example? I'm not sure I'm following.
Sure. Think of a pot. If you smash it, you don't have a pot anymore, right? You just have shards. The idea of that specific pot is gone.
Got it. So it's potness dependent on it being whole.
Exactly. And it's the same with mentally dividing something. Like water, we have this idea of water, but if you start analyzing it, breaking it down into its properties, like its wetness, its temperature, where it is, the idea of water as this single thing kind of dissolves.
Ah, I see. So the conventional is basically anything that falls apart when you analyze it closely.
That's a good way to put it. Now, for the Sarvastivadins, the opposite of that, what's ultimately real, they called it Dravyasat, often translated as foundationally existent.
So something that can't be broken down further, mentally or physically.
Right. And it's not just that it can't be broken down, it's that it exists independently of our minds. It's not something we create with our thoughts. This is in contrast to things that are compositely existent, avaya vidravya, which are, as the name suggests, made up of parts, and therefore belong to the realm of the conventional.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. So for them, a table is conventional because it's made of legs, a top, screws, all these parts. But the tiny particles that make up those parts and the individual moments of awareness we have of them, those are ultimately real.
You got it. They're irreducible, they have their own inherent reality, svabhava, and they're not just figments of our imagination.
That's pretty wild. So they were basically materialists, right? Everything boils down to matter and consciousness.
Well, they actually made a further distinction within this ultimate reality. There's a compounded ultimate, which surprisingly includes the 5 aggregates, form, feeling, perception, mental formations, consciousness.
Wait, the aggregates? Those are usually associated with the person, with our experience, not with ultimate reality.
Right, but for them, it's the aggregates conceived as individual elements, not as a unified, enduring person. So like each moment of seeing, each feeling, each thought, those individual moments, they're ultimately real, but not the person as a whole.
Oh, okay, that's subtle. So the individual components are ultimate, but not the aggregate person.
Oh, exactly. And then they also had the uncompounded ultimate, which is even more mind-blowing. This includes space itself and 2 types of cessation. Analytical cessation, which is the stopping of defilements through wisdom, and non-analytical cessation, which is like a natural absence of certain things.
So space and the stopping of stuff. And these are uncompounded,
Meaning they're not caused by anything else, and they don't exist in space. They're like outside of the normal causal web. Pretty radical, right?
Yeah, it's a whole different picture of reality. So the Sarvastivadins give us this view of reality built from these fundamental irreducible bits, material and mental, and everything else is a kind of combination of them. Now, let's shift gears and look at the Sautrianta school. How did they approach the 2 truths?
The Sautrantikas, with figures like Dignoga and Dharmakirti leading the way, they were really into the nature of knowledge. Like, how do we actually know anything?
Okay, epistemology.
Exactly. They classified everything we can know based on how we know it, either directly through perception, like when you see a tree, or indirectly through inference, like when you infer there's a fire because you see smoke.
Makes sense. Direct versus indirect knowledge.
And this distinction directly informed their take on the 2 truths.
I see. So how we access knowledge determines what's ultimately or conventionally true.
Right. Dharmakirti, in his big work, the Pramachavartakakarika, defines ultimate truth as that which is ultimately causally efficient, meaning it has the power to produce real effects. And he says this is the same as being ultimately existent, paramarthasat, and he identifies it with something called the unique particular, or svalat.
Unique particular, what's that?
Imagine a flash of lightning. It's unique, it happens at a specific time and place, no other flash is exactly like it. That's a unique particular. It's the actual concrete event.
Got it. And conventional truth then is?
Conventional truth, savatisat, is associated with the universal samayalaganai, the abstract concept. So in the lightning example, the universal would be the concept of lightning itself, which applies to all those individual flashes.
Interesting. So unique particular is the concrete event. Universal is the abstract concept. And the Sautrantika said the unique particular is ultimately real.
Yes, because it's what actually does stuff in the world. That specific flash of lightning is what causes the light, the sound, all the effects.
Right, the concept of lightning doesn't cause anything by itself.
Exactly. And they had several reasons for saying unique particulars are ultimately real. They said, only unique particulars are causally efficient, only they appear to our direct perception as distinct things, and language can never fully grasp their unique specificity. And, get this, they even said that directly perceiving unique particulars is how you achieve liberation.
Oh, wow. So seeing the world as it truly is, as this constant flow of unique particulars, that's the path to enlightenment.
That's the idea. And they also said you can't truly express this ultimate reality with words. It's beyond language.
So what do they consider to be these ultimate unique particulars?
3 main categories. Momentary instants of matter, which are like the tiniest bits of physical stuff, momentary instants of consciousness, which are like super quick flashes of awareness, and then momentary instants of non-associated composite phenomena, which are things that aren't strictly mental or physical, like certain types of causal connections.
Okay, so everything is momentary for them, like nothing lasts for more than the split second.
Right. Everything is in constant flux, arising and ceasing from moment to moment. Even something that seems continuous, like a river flowing or a thought, it's actually just a series of distinct events, super close together, but ultimately separate.
Wow, that's a pretty radical view of reality.
They had some pretty strong arguments for this momentariness doctrine, too. They said that spontaneous perishing is just built into the nature of things, that things can't really move but just keep appearing and disappearing in different spots, that our idea of existence is always tied to cause and effect, which implies change, and as we talked about, that liberation requires this direct perception of momentary reality.
Okay, so that's their ultimate truth. Now, what about conventional truth? Where do those universals fit in?
Dharmakirti defines conventional truth as that which is conventionally existent, and he links it to these universals.
Right, the abstract concept.
Yeah, but it's important to note that they had a very specific view of universals. They were nominalists, meaning they believed that universals are just mental constructs, not actual things that exist in the world. This is unlike some other schools like Nyaya Vaishika, who thought universals were real, eternal entities that were in each individual thing.
Okay, so for the Sautrantikas, treeness isn't some real thing out there. It's just a concept we use to group together all the individual trees we perceive.
Exactly. And those individual trees are just temporary collections of matter, momentary events. So universals, for them, have no independent existence. They're just our mental categories.
And why did they say universals are only conventional?
Several reasons. First, we only grasp them through thinking and language, not through direct perception. Second, we can have ideas about things like justice or beauty without needing to see a specific example of them. Third, they can't actually cause anything in the world, they're just concepts. Our mental images of them don't depend on whether a particular instance of that universal is actually present.
So it's like they're saying our concepts are useful, but they don't reflect the true dynamic, momentary nature of reality.
Right. They're kind of like convenient fictions that help us navigate the world, but
Yeah.
they're not ultimately real. And then they have this interesting theory of language called apoha.
Apoka.
Yeah, it means exclusion of the other. They said that words don't actually refer to positive things, like a shared essence. Instead, they work by exclusion. So when you say cow, you're not pointing to some real cowness that all cows share. You're excluding everything that isn't a cow.
That's a totally different way of thinking about language. So meaning comes from what a word excludes, not from what it includes.
Pretty cool, huh? So for the Sautrantikas, you have these two realms, the ultimate, which is all about those unique particulars, and the conventional, which is our world of concepts and language, useful but not ultimately true.
Got it. Now let's move on to the Yogacara school. They took things in a pretty wild direction, didn't they?
Yeah, the Yogacarans, they went full-on idealist. They agreed with the Sautrantikas that our perceptions are representations, that consciousness plays a big role in how we experience things. But they disagreed about where those representations come from. The Sautrantikas still believed in external objects as the ultimate cause, but the Yogacarans said, no, those representations actually come from within.
So the world we experience is a projection of our own minds.
Basically, they said it all comes from these subliminal impressions, vasanas, that are stored in a fundamental level of consciousness called the alaya vijnana, also known as the storehouse consciousness.
Okay, so it's like our mind is projecting the world from these deep impressions, so no real external objects.
They even went so far as to deny the conventional reality of external physical objects. They're like, look, everything you experience as external is actually just your mind doing its thing.
Whoa. That's a huge claim. Who are the main figures behind this mind-only view?
Well, it was a gradual development, but key figures include Maitreyaнаth, Asaga, Vasubandhu, and Dignaga. Later, Shantarakshita and Kamalashila built on their ideas.
Okay, and Maitreyaнаth, in his Dharmadharmatavipagga Karika, he laid out the framework, saying all reality is either phenomena, dharma, or ultimate reality, dharamata, which map onto the two truths.
And for them, conventional truth was almost a negative term. They said it refers to the stuff of our experience, like sights and sounds that appear to exist in a way that contradicts their true nature. Like they seem external and independent, but they're not.
So they're basically saying our everyday experience is kind of deceptive.
Yeah, they said it's false, unreal, and even tricky in how it presents itself to us.
So, like, I see a table and I think it's this solid, separate thing, but they'd say, no, that's just your mind tricking you.
Exactly. They said there are three main ways this conventional truth arises, three kinds of convention. Fabrication, which is all our mental constructions and mistaken ideas. Consciousness itself as the medium through which these appearances arise, and then language, which reinforces our conventional understanding.
So our mind makes it up, language solidifies it, and we're stuck in this illusion.
Pretty much. And these three forms lead to three types of conventional truths. Fabricated phenomena, which are the objects we create in our minds. Mind consciousness itself, which is where these appearances happen, and language, which is the system we use to talk about all this.
Okay, so our whole world is basically just mind stuff. And what about ultimate truth? Where's the reality in all this?
This is where Vasubandhu's theory of the three natures comes in. It's laid out in his Trisvabhakarika. He talks about the dependent nature, the imaginary nature, and the perfect nature. The first two are conventional, and the last one is their ultimate truth.
Okay, so three natures. Let's unpack them. What's the dependent nature?
The dependent nature, Paratantra, is basically the flow of mental events, the stream of consciousness. But it's not the consciousness we're usually aware of. It's deeper. It comes from those vasanas, those subliminal impressions. It's like the raw data of our experience.
Ah, I see. It's the stuff our mind works with, but we're not directly conscious of it.
Right. And then the imaginary nature, Parakalpita, this is how things appear to us. We take this dependent flow of consciousness and we slap on this idea of separate subjects and objects, a perceiver and a perceived.
So we create this duality that isn't really there.
Yeah, they call it an unreal conceptual fabrication. We basically imagine things to be inherently existent, to have their own independent reality when they're actually just dependently arising.
Okay, so that's the imaginary nature, the illusion we create. And what about the perfect nature?
The perfect nature, Parinippana, this is the true reality. It's the dependent nature as it is, without the imaginary duality. It's non-dual, it's consciousness without the subject-object split.
So ultimate truth is just pure non-dual consciousness.
That's the Yogacara view. And they drew on the Orisa Dhanirmukana Sutra to define ultimate truth as reality as it is, which is the intentional object of a pure consciousness. That's the perfect nature, free from our conceptual distortions.
Okay, so it's not some separate reality. It's the true nature of our own consciousness when we stop projecting all this stuff onto it.
Vasubandhu, in his Trishika, takes it even further. He straight up says that the perfect nature is the ultimate, paramartha, that it's ultimate reality, tathata, suchness, and that it's nothing but consciousness itself, vijapti matrata.
Wow, they really doubled down on this mind-only thing.
Yeah, and Stirmati, in his commentary on the Trishika, clarifies that ultimate truth is world-transcending knowledge, likvatara nirvikalpa jana.
So a kind of knowledge that goes beyond our ordinary conceptual way of thinking.
Exactly. It sees through the illusions of conventional reality.
Okay, so to sum up Yogacar's take on the two truths, conventional reality is this world of dependent and imaginary stuff. Basically, our minds creating duality where there is none. And ultimate reality is the perfect nature, pure, non-dual consciousness. Now, how do they convince people of this? It's a pretty out there view.
Well, they had to go up against the realists, those who believed in external objects, and they had to address some pretty tough questions.
Like, how can we tell where things are? How can our mind be continuous? If the outside world is made of separate events, how do we do stuff in the world if there's no real stuff out there?
Right. All those common sense objections. But the yoga currents had some pretty clever responses.
Okay, like what?
Well, they use dreams as an example. Like in a dream, you experience a world with space and time and objects, but it's all just your mind, right?
Right, that's a good point.
And they also talked about priyakas, those hungry ghosts in Buddhist cosmology. They're sad to see things like rivers of pus that others don't see. So shared experience doesn't necessarily prove external objects. It could just be shared mental impressions.
I see. And what about the atoms? Didn't other schools say that the world is ultimately made of atoms?
They had arguments against that, too. They basically said that the whole idea of an atom is logically problematic.
Oh, how so?
Well, they argued if an atom is truly indivisible, how can it be in contact with other atoms? It would need parts to touch them, but that contradicts the whole idea of an atom being partless.
That's a tricky one. And what about direct perception? Surely that proves there's an external world.
They used the dream argument again. You have direct perceptions in a dream, but they don't correspond to anything real. They also pointed out that there's a time lag between when your senses are stimulated and when you actually perceive something.
So like the processing in the brain takes time.
Exactly. So they said what you're actually perceiving is not the external object, but a mental impression of it that lingers even after the object is gone.
Wow, they really thought this through. So their final conclusion was that the only thing we can be sure of perceiving are these vasanas, these mental impressions.
Right. Those are the only things that are even conventionally real for them. And they had other arguments too, based on how different beings experience different worlds, the weird abilities of bodhisattvas and meditators, and intuitive knowledge.
Okay, so it's all mind, all the way down. And the shared world we experience, it's just a result of our collective karma, our shared mental actions.
That's the Yogacara view in a nutshell.
Pretty wild stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, now let's tackle the Madhyamaka school. They're known for their really subtle and sometimes even paradoxical views.
Yeah, Madhyamaka, the middle way, they're the ones who really push the idea of emptiness to its limits.
And the central figure is Nagarjuna, right?
Yes, Nagarjuna probably lived around the 1st and 2nd centuries CE. His Mula Madhyamaka Kartika, usually called the MMK, is one of the most important texts in Mahayana Buddhism.
And he was all about the two truths, wasn't he?
Completely. He said his whole philosophy was based on them. And he didn't see it as just an intellectual game. He said it was crucial for understanding the Buddha's teachings and for achieving liberation.
He even said, without relying on conventional truth, the meaning of the ultimate cannot be explained. And without understanding the meaning of the ultimate, nirvana is not achieved.
Right, so they're inseparable. You need both to get the whole picture. And what's so radical about Nagarjuna is that he breaks with pretty much every other Indian philosophy at the time.
What do you mean?
Most other schools were foundationalist. They believed there was some ultimate reality, some ground of being that everything else was built on.
So like the Sarvastivadins with their atoms and the Yogacarans with their non-dual consciousness, they were all pointing to some fundamental reality.
Right, but Nagarjuna said, nope, it's all empty. Everything, even ultimate truth itself, is empty of inherent existence, empty of svabhava.
So no ultimate building blocks, no fundamental consciousness, just emptiness.
Just emptiness. And even emptiness itself is empty. There's no ultimate ground, no foundation.
Okay, but empty doesn't mean non-existent in the Madhyamaka sense, right?
Yeah.
It's more nuanced.
Exactly. It means that things don't have their own independent, inherent being. They exist, but they exist dependently in relation to other things. This is the idea of praticcasamutpara, dependent arising.
So things arise because of causes and conditions. They don't just exist on their own.
Right. And for Nagarjuna, conventional truth is all about this dependent arising, while ultimate truth is the realization of emptiness, the lack of inherent existence. And these two truths aren't opposed, they're actually two sides of the same coin.
So things can interact and change because they're empty, because they lack this fixed, independent nature.
He famously said, there is no thing that is not dependently arisen, therefore there is no such thing that is not empty.
Now, within Madhyamaka, there's this famous split between the Svatantrika and the Prasika schools. What was the beef there?
It gets a bit technical, but it started with Buddhapalita, a 5th century commentator on Nagarjuna. He emphasized a style of argumentation called prasaga, which basically means pointing out contradictions in your opponent's views without asserting your own positive claims.
So like dismantling their position without saying what your position is.
Exactly. But another Madhyamaka thinker, Bhavaviveka, he said, hold on, we need to make positive arguments too, even if those arguments ultimately point to emptiness.
So he wanted to establish Madhyamaka conclusions, not just critique other views.
Right. And this difference in approach led to the Svatantrika and Prasangika schools. The Svatantrikas used independent arguments, while the Prasagikas stuck with the Prasaga method.
Okay, and some scholars say there are even deeper philosophical differences between them, not just about argumentation.
Yeah, it's debated. Some say they have different understandings of ontology and epistemology, but others say it's mainly about method.
Let's start with the Svatantrikas. What did they think about the two truths?
Bhavaviveka was a key figure for them. He was all about emptiness, but he also thought we need to make positive philosophical arguments. So he rejected the idea of some ultimate foundation, but he said, at the conventional level, subjects and objects do have a kind of intrinsic reality.
So things aren't ultimately real, but they're conventionally real.
That's the Svatantrika take. And even within Svatantrika, there are two branches. the Sautrantika Svatantrikas, who followed Bhavaviveka, and the Yogacara Svatantrikas, who tried to combine Madhyamaka with Yogacara.
Okay, let's stick with Bhavaviveka and the Svatantrikas for now. What were their main ideas?
They had two core theses. First, they said that for ordinary people who haven't really analyzed things, all phenomena appear to have their own inherent intrinsic reality. Second, they said that ultimately, from the perspective of someone with deep insight, everything, except emptiness itself, is actually intrinsically unreal.
So it's like we see the world as solid and real, but that's just our ignorance. When we see things clearly, we see that it's all empty.
Exactly. And Bhavaviveka, in his Tarkajavala, defines conventional truth as incontrovertible linguistic convention. Basically, it's how we talk about and understand the world in our everyday lives. And he says this conventional reality is made up of both unique particulars and universals, like the Sautrantikas.
Okay, so they're drawing on that Sautrantika framework, and they believe in conventional intrinsic reality, right? So things are actually real at the conventional level.
That's their claim. And they had two main arguments for this. First, they said that if things didn't appear to be inherently real at the conventional level, we wouldn't even consider them to be conventional reality. It's like if they didn't seem real, there wouldn't be any convention about them.
Right, it's the seeming reality that makes it a convention.
And second, they said that if we deny conventional intrinsic reality, we're basically saying everything is completely unreal, which leads to a kind of nihilism.
So for them, there has to be some level of reality for things to function and for us to make sense of the world.
Exactly. Now, as for ultimate truth, they were all about emptiness, of course. And Bhavaviveka gave three main interpretations of Paramartha, ultimate truth, all focusing on emptiness. He talked about emptiness as the ultimate object of knowledge, as the object of this higher non-conceptual awareness, and even as the awareness itself.
So emptiness is both what's known and the knowing. Yeah, pretty deep stuff. And he distinguished between two kinds of ultimate. The transcendent, pure emptiness, which is the absence of inherent existence, and then a more elaborative aspect, which is the wisdom or insight that understands this emptiness correctly.
Okay, so there's the emptiness itself, and then there's the realization of emptiness.
Right. And they had several arguments for why everything other than emptiness is ultimately unreal. They analyzed the four elements and showed how they depend on other things for their existence, so they can't be ultimately real. They also argued that everything is ultimately made of parts, even if those parts are atoms, so there's no fundamental, indivisible reality. And then they argued that our perceptions don't necessarily correspond to an inherently real external world.
So lots of ways to show that things lack that ultimate independent existence.
Exactly. So the Sautrantika Svatantrika Madhyamaka, they were holding on to a kind of conventional realism while also affirming ultimate emptiness. Now let's look at the other branch, the Yogacara Svatantrika Madhyamaka.
Yeah, they were trying to bring together Madhyamaka and Yogacara, right? That's right. Shantanakinta and Kamalashila were the big names here. Their main idea was that Yogacarra's idealism, the mind-only view, was a good explanation for conventional truth, while Madhyamaka's emptiness was the ultimate truth.
So they took the Yogacara position that the world is a mental construct, but then they said even the mind itself is empty.
Nailed it. Their two main theses were no real external objects, mind is conventionally real, that's Yogacara, and then even the mind is ultimately unreal, empty, that's Madhyamaka.
That's a pretty bold synthesis.
Shantarakaita famously said that by relying on mind only, you realize external stuff doesn't exist, and then by relying on Madhyamaka, you realize that even the mind is empty of inherent self-nature.
It's like using Yogacara to deconstruct the external world and then Madhyamaka to deconstruct the mind itself.
Right. And for them, ultimate truth was this emptiness, an inherent reality applied to everything, mental and physical. Kamalashila, in his Madhyamakolika, talked about three aspects of ultimate truth. Reality as non-self, the transcendent knowledge of this non-self, and even our ordinary conceptual understanding of non-self as a step towards that higher knowledge.
Okay, so they're acknowledging that even our conceptual understanding can point us towards ultimate truth, even if it's not the ultimate truth itself.
And they used all sorts of Madhyamaka arguments to show this emptiness, like the diamond sliver argument, which refutes the idea of indivisible things, arguments against things arising from self, other, both, or neither, the neither one nor many argument, which says things aren't ultimately one or many, and the argument from dependent arising, which shows that everything arises in dependence on other things.
That neither one nor many argument sounds pretty key. What's that all about?
That's a big one.